She had 400,000 followers and couldn't tell you a single true thing about herself. It had started small, a photo here, a caption there, the kind of thing anyone does when they want to feel seen. But the algorithm is a patient teacher, and it rewards very specific behavior. It rewarded the morning light through the linen curtains. It rewarded the coffee cup angled just so, the soft caption about slow mornings and intentional living. It rewarded the version of her that had her life together. And so, she gave it more of that version. Because the alternative, posting something real, something unresolved, something that didn't resolve neatly into an aesthetic, earned nothing. Less than nothing. The silence after an unperformed post is its own kind of punishment. The social mask is like a filter you applied so many times you forgot what your face looked like underneath. Not dishonest, just practiced, until the practice became the person. And that's the quiet danger of it. Nobody forces you into the performance. You choose it, over and over, in increments so small they never feel like a choice. You choose the angle. You choose the caption. You choose which version of Tuesday makes the cut. And the audience? 400,000 of them, then more. They respond to that chosen version with such warmth, such recognition, that the unchosen version starts to feel like the mistake. She was good at it. That was the real problem. She had cultivated something that looked, from the outside, like wisdom. The kind of woman who had done the inner work, who moved through the world with intention, who knew things. People sent her messages saying she had changed their lives. She read those messages and felt, for a moment, something. And then the moment passed, and she was alone in her apartment, and the apartment was staged for content, and she couldn't remember the last time she had cried without wondering whether it was photographable. At a dinner party, a friend introduced her to someone new. The friend said her follower count before saying her name. There was a beat, a small, suspended moment, and she smiled. The smile came automatically, which was itself a kind of answer. She didn't know whether she was offended or proud, and that not knowing, that blur between the two, that was the thing she couldn't post about. That was the thing with no caption. The ego is the part of you that manages the account, the conscious operator who knows the posting schedule, tracks the metrics, and presents the curated face to the world. It is not the whole of who you are, only the part that knows it exists. And hers had become very, very good at its job. So good that it had taken over the whole apartment, metaphorically speaking. So good that the other parts, the uncertain parts, the parts that didn't photograph well, the parts that wanted something she couldn't name, had been quietly moved to a back room and asked to stay there. The mask was eating. The mask was thriving. 400,000 people were feeding it every day. And somewhere behind it, something else was waiting in the dark and getting very, very hungry. That hunger had a name, and she had never let herself say it out loud. What was waiting in the dark was not some dramatic inner demon. It was just her, the version of her that had never been posted, never been approved, never been rewarded with a notification. The version that existed before the first photo, before the first caption, before she learned which angle of herself the world preferred. That person had not disappeared. She had simply been told, through thousands of quiet repetitions, that she was not the interesting one. And so she had retreated. And the social mask, the persona, the functional identity built for the audience, had stepped into the space she left behind and made itself at home. Here is what was actually happening beneath the surface of her life. The mask was not a lie she had told. That is the important thing to understand. The mask was a costume that had started as a costume, a real, functional tool for navigating the world's expectations, which is what every persona begins as. Every person who has ever walked into a room and adjusted themselves slightly for the audience has worn one. The professor who stands a little straighter at the lectern. The father who lowers his voice to sound more certain than he feels. The woman who picks the angle and the caption and the version of Tuesday that makes the cut. None of that is dishonesty. It is adaptation. The costume works. That is the entire problem. Because the costume worked, she wore it longer. Because she wore it longer, she got better at wearing it. Because she got better at wearing it, the audience grew. Because the audience grew, the rewards increased. And somewhere in that chain, somewhere in the long, compounding logic of it, something shifted. The actor forgot she was acting. The character was no longer a role she played. It became the only person she knew how to be. This is what identification does to a person. Identification is what happens when the actor forgets they are acting, when the character is no longer a role you play, but the only person you know how to be. And it happens so gradually that there is no single moment you can point to. There is no morning you wake up and decide to become the mask. There are only 400,000 small decisions, each one perfectly reasonable, each one nudging you a little further from the self that was there before the first post. And what of that self? The one underneath? The part of her that never posts, never performs, never thinks in captions. That part had been starved. Not cruelly, not intentionally, but systematically, the way anything starves when it is moved to a back room and not consulted. The internal person, the one who had genuine questions and genuine doubts and genuine hungers, had been surviving on whatever leaked through the cracks. A moment of real feeling before the reflex to document it kicked in. A flash of something unnamed at the dinner party. Something between offense and pride that had no caption. These were the cracks, and through them, that interior self was sending signals she couldn't quite translate. The signals she couldn't translate had a shape, though. They had a texture. They were the things she cropped out of every image. The shadow is everything the curated feed cannot hold. The rage at the comments, the envy of other creators, the loneliness at 2 a.m., the material that gets cropped out of every image and grows stronger for being excluded. And her shadow had been accumulating for years, steadily, silently, the way a river rises behind a dam. The rage at the comments she smiled through. The envy when someone newer and less careful than her blew past her numbers. The loneliness of sitting in an apartment staged for content, surrounded by the props of an aspirational life, with no one who knew her actual name before they knew her follower count. None of it had anywhere to go. The brand couldn't hold it. The aesthetic couldn't hold it. So it went somewhere else, into the vast off-camera space where the unrehearsed life goes on. The unconscious is that off-camera space, everything that doesn't make the cut, everything that has never been posted, the whole interior country that the performance never visits. And hers was vast, and she had never once been there. She had been so busy managing the account, so good at being the conscious operator who knew the posting schedule and tracked the metrics, that the other country had been growing in her absence, filling up with everything she had exported from the feed. The doubt, the grief she had turned into a growth moment and then moved on from without ever actually grieving. The years, the question of what she actually wanted as opposed to what performed well. The algorithm did not create this problem. It is worth saying that clearly. The algorithm accelerated a confusion that was already there, the ancient human confusion between the costume and the self. What the algorithm did was reward the costume at a scale and speed that no previous human environment had managed. It made the confusion profitable. It gave her 400,000 reasons to keep wearing the mask. And so the splitting happened quietly, at scale. Dissociation operating the way it always does. The mask going one way, the person underneath going another, until they were so far apart that the person underneath didn't know how to speak without the mask's voice. But there is a second layer to this, and it is the more dangerous one. Because she had not only started performing for the audience, she had started performing for herself. Somewhere in the middle of all that positive reinforcement, a story had formed. Not just that the mask was her, but that her story was a significant one. That the journey she was narrating, the arc of growth and intention and becoming, was not just content. It was a calling. She had started to suspect, quietly and without saying it directly, that she was someone exceptional. That the hero's journey she was selling to her audience was, in fact, hers. That all of this, The morning light, the coffee cup, the 400,000 people watching meant something larger than a posting schedule, that she had been chosen. And that belief, that quiet, unexamined conviction that her ego's story and the great human story were the same thing, was not a quirk of her personality. It was a structure. And structures have a logic. They move in a direction. And once you understand the direction, what happens next stops looking like bad luck and starts looking like physics. Here is the mechanism, the self, the deeper organizing center of the whole personality, the intelligence that drives you toward wholeness whether you cooperate or not, is not interested in your metrics. It does not care about the morning light or the coffee cup or the 400,000 people watching, but it sends its energy upward regardless, like a current moving through whatever channel is available. And the channel that was available in her case was the mask. The mask was the only door left open, and so the energy came through the mask, and the mask received it, and the ego, the conscious operator, the account manager, felt that current move through it and called it vision, called it purpose, called it proof. This is what inflation does to a person. Inflation is what happens when your follower count starts to feel like evidence of destiny. When the ego borrows the hero's grandeur, wears it like a cape, and forgets the cape belongs to something far older and far larger than any personal brand. The self's energy is real. The current is real. The feeling of significance that comes with it is real. What is not real is the ego's claim to ownership of it. The ego receives the charge and says, "This is mine. This is me. I am the one who matters." And in that moment of misidentification, that quiet theft of something that belongs to the whole, not to any single person, the inflation begins. The collective unconscious is the layer of the mind that belongs to no one person, the place where the hero myth, the prophet archetype, the visionary pattern live, charged and ready, waiting to be triggered by whoever gets enough attention for long enough. She had gotten enough attention for long enough, and now those patterns were moving through her. An archetype is one of those ancient story shapes wired into the human mind before any personal experience. The hero, the visionary, the prophet. Patterns so large and so charged that when they rise through you, your small ego mistakes their size for its own. The pattern was enormous. The pattern was thousands of years old. It had moved through prophets and poets and martyrs and mystics, and now it was moving through a woman with a staging aesthetic and a content calendar, and she had no way to tell the difference. The size felt like her size. The charge felt like her charge. The calling felt like her calling. This is possession, not the theatrical kind, not the dramatic kind, but the mundane and deeply ordinary kind that happens to people who are simply not paying a particular type of attention. Possession is when the archetype takes the wheel, when you are no longer using the hero myth to understand your life, but the hero myth is using you, and you've stopped noticing the difference. She was not using the story of the visionary to orient herself. The story of the visionary was using her, running her schedule, shaping her language, deciding what Tuesday meant. And because it felt so right, because the numinous charge, that electric sense that what you're doing matters cosmically, the feeling that grabs hold of you when the archetype breaks through, the hair on the neck aliveness that the inflated ego mistakes for proof of its own greatness. Because that charge felt so alive and so clarifying, she had no reason to question it. The question never formed. When something feels that true, the questioning instinct turns off, and so the gap grew. The gap between what the ego actually was, one person, one life, one apartment staged for content, and what it believed itself to be, the carrier of something universal, the one who had been chosen, the messenger. That gap grew in silence, because nothing from the outside was measuring it. The audience was not measuring it. The audience was feeding it. The comments were confirmation. The DMs were confirmation. The follower count ticking upward was the most elegant confirmation of all, because it arrived in numbers, and numbers feel like evidence. 400,000 reasons to believe the cape was yours. But there is a principle at work underneath all of this, and it does not negotiate. Compensation is the inner system's correction. When the mask grows too dominant, something in the off-camera country pushes back, usually through exhaustion, numbness, or the sudden sense that nothing you post feels real anymore. She had started to feel it, not dramatically, not all at once, a flatness after a post that had performed well, a reluctance some mornings to open the app. Not burnout, she told herself, just recalibration. The content still went up, the schedule still held, but something had started to feel like going through motions, and the going through motions feeling was the correction beginning. The inner system nudging, the off-camera country sending a signal through the only channel the ego might still be listening to, the quality of aliveness in the work. She ignored it, because you can ignore it, at least for a while. And then the algorithm changed. It changes. It always changes. The particular arrangement of rewards that had trained her into the mask, that had made Tuesday into content and grief into a growth moment, that arrangement shifted, the way weather shifts, without announcement or apology. The numbers dipped. The reach contracted. The audience that had felt like proof began to feel like a tide going out, and she stood on the shore where the water had been and felt something she could not name and could not post about and could not resolve into an aesthetic. This is the reversal. The moment anything pushed too far flips into its own opposite. The inflation does not deflate slowly and politely. It does not give you time to prepare. It collapses because it was always going to collapse, because the structure was always unsustainable, because an ego that has borrowed the size of something ancient and universal and called that size its own cannot hold the position indefinitely. The weight is not the ego's weight to carry, and when the support withdraws, when the algorithm shifts, when the audience thins, when the performance loses its crowd, the ego, having no size of its own left, having exported all of it into the mask, discovers that it is very small and very alone in a very staged apartment with no one who knew her name before they knew her number. The fall is not bad luck. It is not bad timing. It is not a failure of strategy or a mistake in the content calendar. The fall is built into the inflation, the way the landing is built into the leap. You cannot borrow that much grandeur from something that old and that large and expect to keep it. The hero's journey is real. The visionary is real. The prophet is real. But they are real as patterns that move through human lives, not as identities that belong to any one person. The ego that claims the pattern as its own is not the hero. It is the person who put on the hero's costume and forgot it was a costume. And the crash is just the costume falling off, which it was always going to do, because costumes fall off, and the thing underneath is just a person, which was the problem the whole performance was built to avoid. So the crash comes, and here is the only question that matters in the wreckage. What is the alternative? Not abandoning the mask. You cannot function in the world without some version of it, and destroying it entirely is its own kind of violence. Not retreating into the off-camera country and refusing to perform at all. That is just the reversal wearing different clothes, something harder than either of those. The alternative is learning to hold the mask lightly, to wear it, to use it, to post Tuesday when Tuesday is worth posting, without ever again mistaking it for the self underneath, to carry the archetype's energy without claiming it, to feel the numinous charge without calling it yours, to be the channel, not the source, to stay, as one version of this understanding puts it, an ordinary human being, conscious of your incompleteness, because only that incompleteness keeps you receptive to what is actually moving through you rather than what the ego wants to believe it is generating on its own. That is not a comfortable place to stand. It requires something the inflated ego finds almost impossible: the willingness to be small, to be partial, to be the person rather than the prophet, even when the prophet feels more real, even when the prophet has 400,000 people who prefer the prophet to the person. The question is not whether you can see the mask. By now, after the crash, she could see it clearly enough. The question is what you do next. Standing in the wreckage of something that felt so true for so long, when you finally understand that seeing through the mask is not the same as knowing what is underneath it. What is underneath the mask is not another, better mask. It is a person who does not yet know how to exist without being watched. And that is not a flaw to fix, but a condition to work with. Here is where most people make the wrong move. They delete the account, which is itself a performance, the carefully staged authenticity of stepping back. Or they double down, make the collapse into a growth moment, the way she made her grief into one years before. Both moves keep the mask running. Both fill the gap with more performance. And the gap is exactly where the real work lives. The move is smaller than deleting the account. The move is noticing the gap. There is a moment, and you know this moment, between what you feel and what you post, between the 2 a.m. feeling that has no name and the morning caption that has too many. That gap is not a problem to solve. That gap is the only place in your digital life where the real person is still breathing. The practice is learning to stay there, not to perform from it, not to mine it, but to inhabit it long enough to hear what it is trying to say. Before you post, ask one question. Not, is this good content? Ask, whose approval am I seeking right now? Because sometimes the answer is your audience, which is honest, and at least you know it. But sometimes the answer is someone who does not follow you, someone who told you years ago that you were too much or not enough. Sometimes you are performing for a ghost. There is a man who checks his follower count before he checks in with himself, 5 times before noon, the way you check a wound. The practice for him is not to stop checking. The practice is to check himself first. One question before he opens the app. How am I actually? Not, how is the account? How is the person? It takes 15 seconds and surfaces things he has been exporting to the off-camera country for months. There is a woman who can describe her personal brand in 3 sentences, but cannot describe what she actually feels at 2 a.m. The practice for her is 5 minutes a day in the illegible version of herself. Not to post about it, not to mine it, just to let Tuesday be Tuesday, unedited, and see what is actually there. And there is the person who tells the story of their life as though they are the hero of an epic, and who is exhausted by it. The practice is to put the epic down for a day. Cook a meal that isn't photographed. Be bored in a room without making the boredom meaningful. The ego that has borrowed the hero's cape needs to feel what it is like to stand without it, because the cape was never yours to own. You are allowed to be just a person in an apartment. That is the only sustainable place to stand. To wear the mask deliberately, knowing you are wearing it, and to take it off when you come home. This is not a metaphor. It is a daily practice. You put on the performance voice when you perform. Then you return to something that does not perform and leave the mask at the door. Not because the mask is bad, because you are not the mask. The mask will never give you what you actually need. It can deliver attention, which is not the same as being known. Thousands of people can know the curated version of Tuesday, and none of them know you. What you need is to be known without the mask, to have someone see the 2 a.m. version and remain. The algorithm cannot provide that, because the algorithm only sees content, and you are not content. In the off-camera country, the part that has never been posted and never will be, that person is still there. The question is whether you can stop performing long enough to find out what it actually wants. What it actually wants is not more attention. What it actually wants is rest from the performance. The particular rest that only comes when you stop needing the audience to confirm that you exist. That is the movement this episode has traced. A mask that started as a costume and became a cage. An ego that borrowed the size of something ancient and called it destiny, and then stood in the wreckage when the borrowing came due. A person who could not describe what she felt at 2 a.m., but could describe her brand in 3 sentences. And the slow, unglamorous work of closing that distance. None of it resolved cleanly. None of it becomes content. The deepest work a person can do is almost entirely illegible from the outside, which is exactly why the algorithm cannot touch it, and cannot reward it, and cannot teach you how to do it. The mask is not the enemy. It never was. The mask becomes the cage only when you forget it is a mask. When the follower count becomes the soul's address. when the version of Tuesday that performed well becomes the only Tuesday you can remember. That intelligence driving you toward wholeness is not interested in your brand. It is not impressed by the numbers. It is interested in your wholeness, which is a different project entirely. Slower, less legible, requiring things the feed cannot hold. The unperformed grief, the unnamed 2 a.m. feeling, the question you stopped asking because the asking didn't photograph well. These are not the failures of the story. These are the story, the real one, the one that was running underneath the whole time. And here's the thing to carry out of this. The person underneath the performance has not gone anywhere. They have been in the off-camera country all along, waiting with the patience of something that knows it cannot be optimized away. The long work of becoming yourself, not the self the algorithm wants, but the one that was there before the first post. That work does not happen in the feed. It happens in the gap, in the 15 seconds before you open the app, in the meal that isn't photographed, in the room where you are bored without making the boredom meaningful, in the Tuesday that gets to just be Tuesday. That person, unposted and unperformed, waiting in the quiet, that is the only one worth knowing, and they have been waiting for you to come home.